So I have a confession to make. Alex asked who was their first time here at this meetup, and that was me, but I didn't raise my hand because I'm not a back-end person. You're gonna have to listen to a front-end guy now. So welcome, you can't leave now, the doors are locked. We'll go ahead and start. First off, my name's Devan. I used to work at Envy Labs. I don't anymore. People don't know that because I transitioned out quietly. One of the companies I work for is Telegraph Creative. The other is Regions. I know, thrilling. You can find me on Twitter, and just like Santosh, I make very vague statements that are my opinion, and you probably won't like. So, yep. So today we're just going to touch over a few things quickly. Definitely not getting in depth with backend people. I can answer questions afterwards. But what is GraphQL? Why would you use GraphQL? The differences between REST and GraphQL, how GraphQL works, how mature is it, and how can you use it right now, like when you leave here. So it was a while ago, REST was big, and then all of a sudden this GraphQL thing happened, and it happened fast. It happened so fast. It was just released, the spec, a few years ago, and then 2016 it just blew up and it's kept going and going and going. So what is it? Well, GraphQL in a nutshell is a query language for your API. The worst thing about GraphQL has to be the naming of it. Thank you, Facebook. Also, Facebook. Have you ever thought about that name? That's a weird name too. So what is GraphQL? Well, it's just a specification. It's transport agnostic. It's database agnostic. It is literally just a specification that was created by some Facebook engineers when they were transitioning from their web mobile app to their native mobile app, and they saw that REST was not working for them because they were transporting a lot of data back and forth to these tiny little phones, draining battery power, stuff like that. So they created a specification. It's just a query language and is not a database query language at all. Like I said, it's database agnostic. For the front-end people here, it is a declarative way of fetching data. For the back-end people, it probably isn't much to you. You just set it up so the front-end guys shut up and do their work. Just being honest. It is more efficient than REST. We'll kind of touch on that because there's no round trips. In REST, you have multiple endpoints for resources. That's not the way it works in GraphQL. So why would you, as back-end developers, be interested in it? Well, it's self-documenting. That's the easiest. When you write a query, that's just how it is. You write one string, it tells what that query is. The front-end guys can look at that when they're exploring the schema, and you're done. I mean, it's pretty self-declarative because it is graph-based with nodes and edges and everything. So it's easy for front-end developers to understand. It's strongly typed, so you get that advantage if that's your kind of thing. And you can say goodbye to all these resource views so that, again, the annoying front-end people will go away from you and leave you alone. And it has very good tooling, better, I would say, than REST. Particularly, I mean, everyone uses Postman. GraphQL has its own kind of tools that allow you to query and make mutations to your data, but also see your schema and understand what's happening inside of it, all from one place. No more hitting multiple endpoints to see if it works or not. I'm just saying it. But if you notice, Kevin smiles right there at the end, right? Because the silver lining is that REST kind of sucks, but it also has its place, just like any other technology. GraphQL is just another thing that's challenging the status quo of REST. So, but how is it different as back-end developers? Well, like I was saying, there's only a single endpoint in a GraphQL server. Typically, it's at /GraphQL as opposed to all the many views that you expose for front-end developers. You only get 200 response codes. I mean, there's no 404s. There's none of that kind of stuff that you expect to return to front-end developers if they hit something that's not there or something. So you get a 200, you always get a response. It's just, does it have errors in that response or not? An errors key, basically. Again, all these views are gone. There's better tooling, and of course, there's none of these HTTP status codes. I don't know why I duplicated all that stuff. Anyway, so let's get to the good stuff. Now that I got your attention and you're curious to see how it works. So GraphQL relies on a schema and then resolvers. And like I said, that schema is strongly typed. So we can look at this example. There are queries, mutations, and subscriptions in GraphQL. Obviously, querying for data is only reading. Mutations is actually reading and writing at the same time as opposed to just writing. And subscriptions is just getting constant data back and forth so that you know if something updates. The way this works is in your schema, you define a type of query, a type of mutation, a type of subscription. And this is what you would do as a backend developer. And then you would write out, for instance, in these queries, we have a user list query. And if you look at that, if you can see it, it's returning an array of users. That's all it's doing. The exclamation points just declare if it's nullable or non-nullable. In the mutation, we've created a mutation called create post, and it accepts two arguments, a title and an author email, and both are required. They have the exclamation points, and it returns an array of posts. So, like I said, in a mutation in GraphQL, when you call that mutation, you pass in any data, you're also going to get a response back. So, like I was saying, there's no round trips in GraphQL. You can ask for what you want back when you send that mutation, and it will give you back what you may want immediately instead of having to query one more time to get data. There's also there's default scalar types, strings and booleans and everything, but you can also create your own types. In this case, there's a user type and a post type. You know, it has an ID, there's strings, booleans, and on the user, there are posts associated that is just an array of posts. So it's pretty simple as far as the schema goes. The resolvers are a little different. So resolvers and schema, your queries and mutations map one-to-one with the resolver. So in this case, this is a query type, and then this is the user list. Now, I did not write the SQL, and I can't write SQL to save my life. So I hope that's correct. I copied it from some like website. I know, great front-end developers. So the way resolvers work is that you name it whatever is equal to that method that you defined in your schema, and you're going to go back 4 parameters: a parent, an args, context, and an info. So the parent, as you nest down in your schema and a developer makes a request with nested structures, the parent is the resolver immediately above it. It's parent resolver. So in the case that maybe you make a request in the parent resolver and you have that data, in that resolver for that individual field, you could just ask the parent for that data too. So you don't have to make another request for that data. Args is just whatever arguments they pass in to, you know, the mutation, or the query can accept arguments as well if you need to send in any IDs or anything you want to query by. Context is things that gets passed to all resolvers. So some things like that may be authorization headers, for instance. Info is basically the query, because the way this works is that whatever you put into, in my case, GraphQL JS or whatever other language you use, it's parsed out into a tree, and that info is what's returned. The tree itself is returned in the info key. So, and then inside of your resolver, you do whatever magical stuff you need to do to get the data and return it. So you can return null or nothing. You can return an array of data. You can return a promise, or you can return an error as well. You could throw an error from within that too. The good thing about GraphQL is if you do return an array, it's going to map all those values automatically. If you return an error, it's going to automatically put that in a special key that gets returned, so that the developer who made the request doesn't have to look for the data. They can just look for the errors key, get their errors out of there. That's a basic query resolver. Mutation resolvers are the same, effectively. Again, I didn't write this mumbo jumbo SQL stuff, so hope it's correct. But again, you get your args the same way, and you can execute whatever you want. So the value is that GraphQL is database agnostic. You can do whatever you want in that resolver. You can do multiple things in that resolver if you want. All you care about is giving data back to the resolver so that it can resolve it to the request. So we're all good, but how do we use it without screwing up lamps and things in our office? How mature is it? Well, these are 4 questions I kind of ask myself when I look at a new technology as a front-end developer. There's one every hour, it seems like. And I ask myself some questions. Does this tool or framework have an active and responsive community? It's Facebook. Yes, everyone flocks to things our Facebook overlords create. So there is a community. There's many communities. Apollo, the GraphQL team, which is now Prisma, is what we'll talk about them in a few minutes. It's definitely an active and responsive community. Is the tool and framework relatively mature and used in production elsewhere? Yes, I mean, okay, fine. Facebook's huge, and we all wish we could have fancy things like them. But there are smaller companies that are using it, like Twitter. Come on. Instagram, Coursera, there are large companies that are behind this, that are putting their time, their open source time into it. And that's probably why it's just gaining speed and becoming larger and larger. Is the tool and framework intuitive and easy to use? To me, it is. That's kind of like a relative question, I guess. As a front-end developer, it makes sense for me to use it because it's easier for me to query as opposed to REST endpoints. As a back-end developer, it probably is the same thing as dealing with REST. You just want the front-end guys to shut up, so you kind of give them whatever they need. That's your own kind of answer to question to answer. Does incorporation of the tool and framework have the potential to increase performance? Yes, you're not sending so much data back and forth, right? I mean, you as a developer just tell it where to go and it handles resolving that data for you. So you can get infinitely nested, and there are bad things that can happen after that. But as far as the performance goes, you're going to have more efficient queries, and you're going to be returning more efficient data to the developer, right? As a developer, I don't get tons of fields that I didn't ask for. I only get the things that I request. So it is more efficient, and it can increase performance. Whoa. Oh. So how can I use it now? This is pretty nice. If you want to just go home and play with GraphQL server, I would suggest you go to, it's called Launchpad, launchpad.graphql.com. And what they do is they set you up with a whole lot of tiny print that you probably can't read. There we go. So they set you up with just a basic GraphQL server. It's already got a basic query in here. It's already got a basic resolver. And they're already handling headers and secrets for you. So you could throw those in there if you want. And you can play around with how that works. So you can make a query and see what the result is. And you can do whatever you want in that. Another option you can use is just wrap REST APIs with GraphQL. There's tons of blog posts about this. More and more people doing it because they don't want to rewrite their whole endpoints and their whole API in GraphQL. So they just wrap their current REST API with GraphQL. And yes, it's not as performant, right? Because you're still making requests to a REST endpoint. You're still getting a ton of data back. And then you're just kind of shuffling it off to the, what is happening? Okay, I don't know. You're still getting a lot of data, and you're still sending it back to GraphQL. So you're still making that request. It's nasty thing still. Oh, your computer's dying. I know what's happening. No, go for it. Wait. Alex just ruining the talk. Oh, man. Anyways, so you can go and wrap your REST API right now using Apollo Launchpad if you wanted to try to do that. Other options, you can build what are called bindings. So the way these work is binding is another API, and it's been simplified. Basically, let me see if I can find an example down in here. Of course, why would they ever make it easy to show an example of a binding? Here we go. All right. So here's a good example of a binding. So by using the context that you pass around to every resolver, you could create some type of binding that is just a simplified object that has a GraphQL endpoint behind it, and you share that binding. So in my current job, I unfortunately have to deal with Magento e-commerce, and I'm writing a binding for Magento so that I don't have to write those queries over and over. I can just give it an object with specified like query and then users if I want them or something. Bindings are becoming larger, more and more prevalent. There's tons of them out there. Other options, you can use Apollo Server. So Launchpad is just kind of something you can play with, and then you can download that Launchpad instance, and it will be Apollo Server. Now, Apollo Server is going through some transitions right now, but you give it your type definitions, your schema, and then you give it resolvers, and it just spins up a server for you. So you could write out a simple schema and simple resolvers and see what happens locally. Another option is, if you're lazy like me, and their website sometimes works, this is called Prisma. It used to be called GraphQL, but it is a layer that sits in between your database and your server, your GraphQL server, and it transitions things. So it will look at your database schema, and it will automatically create everything it needs to create like a full CRUD API through GraphQL for you. There's still, like, it only works on MySQL right now. They just released Postgres support, but they're adding more and more. So it's pretty interesting. I'd say check it out. And then it makes, so this is where I stole that SQL from, you're about to see. So if this was the SQL that you would have written for like MySQL for your user query, that's what it looks like if you use Prisma. So they're using a binding, and you make a query to users, and then you can pass it anything you want. Same with mutations. Is creating a post, you pass it in the data. It handles all the magic stuff to go to SQL and do everything it needs and resolve correctly. So it's pretty neat. I would say give it a shot. And there's also GraphQL Yoga, which is just another server. It is Apollo Server, but it is Express wrapped up, Apollo Server wrapped up, a bunch of other things for subscriptions, so they're already baked in. It has tracing for through Apollo Engine, just lots of things pre-baked into what is a good GraphQL server these days. So I'd say give those a shot. So that is a very quick, high-level intro, and I know there's going to be tons of questions. There always is. So bring it on. All right, easy. Done. Oh, no.
So I was kind of wondering, it looks like you're kind of exposing a lot of your database so it could be called by the front end directly. And I didn't really see anything for kind of security considerations or authentication authorization. Is there anything to kind of built for that?
Yeah, I purposely avoided those subjects because they can get very heated, at least people I've been around that talked about it. So authorization, for the most part, the community has adopted JWTs that you pass through as a header, right? And then you receive that JWT and you do your magic in the resolver based upon that. There are other security things. There's a very good talk about from Twitter that happened at GraphQL Summit this past year on how Twitter is securing their endpoint so that as a user, I can't make some query that's super nested and then I get into some type of cyclical problem basically down there. And the way those kind of build out is that you give a numerical value to each resolver and you say how hard it is to resolve that data. So if it's just a basic all users query, you may just give it a value of 1, but you may have some other query that takes a lot more, intensive CPU work, and you give it a value of 5. And the way Twitter handles that is they cap you, I think they cap you at like 40. So you can't make a query with, after all those queries that you make nested, that value, the value cannot be more than 40 on their end, or they just cut you off. They don't even let you make the request. There's other security things like that I've never actually instituted them, but I'd say give that talk a look. It was very good. I think it was Tom Ashworth is his name from Twitter at GraphQL Summit 2017. So good question. Yeah. Yep.
So when comparing REST to GraphQL, I've heard that the process so with REST, there's this consideration you have as a designer of a REST API. How do I make changes to it that are non-breaking changes?
Yep.
You know, even that's hard to do because analyzing your REST API is hard because you're not really sure. Yes, I have a user's endpoint, but how often is my front-end designer asking for the user's endpoint and this second endpoint and this third endpoint? It's hard to make sense of like how all these are connected. And so I've heard GraphQL, you don't have the problem, or it's a different problem, or?
So there is ways, Facebook's experimenting with different values you can add in your schema to mark something as deprecated on the front end. So if a user makes that request, they'll get a message back that it was deprecated, but it will allow the response for a certain amount of time. There's also a lot of like tracing packages that you can look through and see how those are resolving, and you can watch how users are actually using those endpoints. For the most part, I haven't heard those concerns, honestly. I mean, I don't know much about REST though. I don't build those kinds of things. I don't really build GraphQL endpoints either, but I just eat them. I like them. They're good consuming them.
But it's true that with GraphQL, because every client is asking exactly for what they need, I think for a backend designer that might be nice because you essentially can see like, oh, I'm getting these requests, you know, in this format very consistently. And so that informs design decisions, I think, probably easier than in a REST system.
Well, it is more efficient, yeah. So. Oh dear. Oh no.
So there have been similar ideas before. Are you familiar with OData at all?
I've heard of this, but I've never used it. Yeah. I don't know much about it. Also, soap. Don't talk to me about soap. That's something I use in the shower. So.
This is probably a terrible question, but any thoughts on why GraphQL might succeed where OData might not?
I probably couldn't give you an answer.
That's
I don't
all right.
know much about
Other
it,
questions? Is it web scale?
You just got to scale it like a regular server. There's not much to handle, I guess. Yeah. I mean, the crux is on your resolving the data. I mean, you have to anticipate that you'll have so many users hitting one endpoint, yes, requesting so much data, but it's as efficient as the data being resolved. And you can also see the like response time and all that as well if you trace it. But it's like deer in headlight looks, sorry. I didn't answer your question, I did.
I guess the way I see it is if you have a GraphQL instance, what stops me from being like, okay, give me everything? And you mentioned putting weights on it to limit it, but even if with those weights, I can be like, all right, so 40, so I just create a request that use up 40 every single time, and I just spam the hell out of it.
Yeah, so I mean, they're using those weights. They're also using rate limiting, right? And they're also using depth limiting. So you can only go so deep as well. So that's how Twitter's handling it, and they're probably the biggest one that will talk about it. Facebook won't open source much data about how they're resolving security like that. So,
all right, question.
It's a valid, I mean, yeah.
So we use something called Open API specification.
Yep.
So how does this fit into the picture?
I don't know much about Open API, but it's just a spec for exposing REST endpoints, like Swagger, I guess, or something like that.
Yeah, Swagger, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So there's none of that has formed yet. The community is still storming and forming on some type of specification because it's not opinionated. Even when I was working at Envy and at my new place, we still have issues with bike shedding. Like, what do we name this thing? I mean, in a REST API, it was pretty basic. You know, this is where the endpoints were. This is how you could expect plurals to work and everything. But none of that's really come out yet.
Do you, another question, do
Yep.
you know of any tools or frameworks that play well to connect Graph API to regular REST-based APIs?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, actually the Magento e-commerce thing I'm having to build with right now, it is a Swagger API, and I really didn't want to recreate all the craziness that it is. There's several tools out there that you can point at an endpoint, and it will just read through the whole endpoint and spit out a GraphQL schema, and then you just create your resolvers based on that. So I think it's called Swagger to GraphQL on GitHub is what I was using. It's decent. I mean, what you can expect.
From an environment architecture perspective, is this run as an additional service within your environment that as you stand up new endpoints for GraphQL, say interpretation, that you can choose to, say for your user's endpoint, choose whether you want to use the REST interface or the GraphQL? Is that a correct interpretation?
So again, GraphQL is only one endpoint. It's only one endpoint for all resources, but I know people are standing up side by side REST and GraphQL, but I don't know how that's working for them. I knew there would be these back-end questions that I can't answer, to be honest. Y'all were gonna like quiz me hard. But
okay.
I'm sorry, yeah. I just know JavaScript crap. Sorry, useless. Please do go look at it though, please. I mean, don't write it off just because I can't give you answers. I've found it enjoyable that when I've used it, and I've used it more and more. So there is some resources out there. You're on the next slide. If you want to go like figure out how to write a GraphQL server yourself, you can go to howtographql.com. There's a really good Node. There's a Ruby one. They're about to add a Sangria one. There's also podcasts, and Apollo itself is really good. So.
Seriously, thanks for doing that, man. Good work.